Everybody loves an iceberg. Well, except the people on the Titanic, obviously, and what a clever little segue into our first story. The Titanic never sank. Well, there's about 1,500 people who would disagree with that, one of those people being James Cameron, who's visited the wreckage 33 times. However, this silly little conspiracy theory suggests that the most famous maritime disaster of all time never actually happened. The Titanic never sank, because the Titanic was actually switched with her sister ship, the Olympic, at the last minute, and the Olympic was sunk on purpose in a giant insurance scam.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Where do we even start with this one? Well, you know that sinking a ship on purpose is not exactly good advertising for your business, which is exactly what the Titanic, the Olympic, and the other sister ship, the Britannic, were. They were businesses. And coincidentally, the reason that they were built in the first place was to compete in the ongoing cruise industry rivalry. And to make money, which is pretty fucking hard to do when the ship is at the bottom of the ocean. But let's take a step back to see if there's any validity to these claims at all. Spoiler alert, there isn't. According to Popular Mechanics, quote, "The British White Star Line, who owned the Titanic, had stiff competition in England and across the globe. Locally, it had a fierce rivalry with the Cunard Steamship Company, which in 1906 and 1907 had sent on its maiden voyage the world's then largest passenger ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. To compete with these two ships, the White Star Line entered into a giant ship war. Back in 1902, when dinosaurs still walked the earth, the White Star Line had become a property owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a holding company bankrolled by the famed financier J.P. Morgan. With Morgan's permission, White Star chairman Bruce Ismay began work on what came to be known as the Olympic-class ships. If they couldn't match the Lusitania's speed, the Olympic-class ships would outclass Cunard ships. They'd be even bigger and more luxurious. 3 ships were then commissioned: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic." End quote. Now, the RMS Olympic was the first to be built and was the flagship of the White Star Line's 3 Olympic-class liners. Contrary to what crazy people conjure up in their imaginations and put into books, the Olympic actually had a 24-year-long career and was in service from 1911 to 1935. This, just by the way, includes her time in service as a troop ship going by the name the HMT Olympic. She helped out during the First World War, survived it, and even rammed and sank the German U-boat U-103, earning her the nickname Old Reliable. Well, surviving one collision is impressive, but what about second collision? Just shortly after being built and sailing out on her 5th voyage on September 20th, 1911, the Olympic was sailing alongside the British cruiser, the HMS Hawke, when the Olympic suddenly turned to starboard, which means turning to the right, and the wide radius of a turn caught the captain of the Hawke by surprise, and he wasn't able to get out of the way in time. The Hawke's bow, which was designed to sink ships by ramming them, collided dead on into the Olympic starboard side, tearing 2 massive holes in the Olympic's hull, which flooded 2 watertight compartments. Not good, but also not bad, because the Olympic and the Titanic were designed to be able to handle that. The HMS Hawke, however, was probably not designed to ram a ship the size of the Olympic and took some serious damage, nearly capsizing. Fortunately though, the Olympic and the Hawke were both repaired, but the Hawke was later sunk by the German U-boat the SMU-9. And that's why Old Reliable came to get her revenge, ramming that German U-boat that took out her friend the Hawke. Now, wouldn't that have been an amazing story if it were true? If the Olympic sank the same U-boat that took out her friend the Hawke. But it wasn't the same U-boat that the Olympic took out. But I guess I could just make up some grand conspiracy theory about how the German U-boats were switched at the last minute and the Olympic actually sank the same one that sank the Hawke. But I didn't start this channel to bullshit people. I started this channel because I'm tired of people's bullshit. It's so easy to lie and make up stories. Anyway, the point is that the Olympic and the Hawke collided, but after this accident, ancient conspiracy theorists suggest that the Olympic became an economic disaster. An economic disaster that continued to operate for 24 years. However, they say that because of this massive lawsuit between the Olympic and the Hawke, the Olympic's repairs would not be covered by insurance and it was bleeding money while just sitting in dry dock. So the White Star Line did the old switcheroo and put a big ol' "Hello, my name is the Titanic" sticker on the Olympic, while the new ship, the actual Titanic, was renamed the Olympic. And as I understand it, the plan was then to take the damaged ship, the Olympic, out to sea and then deliberately get into an accident or another collision so that they could receive an insurance payout. But firstly, what the fuck is the point? As far as I can tell, both ships were insured for the same amount, about the equivalent of 5 million American dollars in today's money. And they both cost more than that to build, the equivalent of about 7.5 million American dollars. Therefore, they would have lost money. Secondly, I don't know if the people claiming this have ever worked in the maritime industry in any capacity, because if you know anything about that industry, these people love paperwork. They love paperwork like how P. Diddy loves baby oil, like how Gordon Ramsay loves swearing, like how the Mystorian loves swearing. I had fucking folders upon folders upon folders of paperwork going back like 5 years. This is shit like work schedules, contracts, training records, insurance shit, and a bunch of other papers I never read once because honestly, there wasn't enough hours in a day. But this idea that the White Star Line could have just switched the ships is fucking ludicrous to me. But hey, it was 1912, dinosaurs still walked the earth, it was a different time back then, so maybe they could have. However, I am 99.99% sure that if they did just switch them, there would be a record of it. And because the Titanic is the most famous maritime disaster of all time, somebody would have found that proof by now. Now, to make this conspiracy even worse, people say that the White Star Line's goal was to deliberately sink the Olympic, secretly now operating as the Titanic. Well, when exactly were they planning on getting into this collision? Because they had been traveling for over 2,000 miles before they hit the iceberg. And here's another question. Why do this with 1,500 passengers on board? And one of their so-called best captains, Captain Edward Smith. Although that is debated, I guess, but interesting fact, Captain Smith was actually aboard the Olympic when it hit the Hawk. So debate it all you like, I'm not here to talk about this guy. Something else that makes this conspiracy theory even worse is that some people suggest that JP Morgan had made the switch, eager to use an inferior ship to drown his enemies on board. Holy shit. Apparently, something that kind of supports this batshit crazy conspiracy theory is that the Titanic did not allow for a public examination before its maiden voyage. Supposedly, out of fear that it would be noticed that, hey, this is actually the Olympic. That claim is total fucking bullshit. The Titanic was inspected and certified to sail, albeit with very outdated regulations. But even though the Titanic and the Olympic were incredibly similar, there were some big differences, specifically on its promenade. These differences would have been noticed. They were not small differences, they were huge differences. The most noticeable one was that the forward half of the Titanic's A-deck promenade was enclosed by a steel screen with sliding doors, whereas the Olympic's promenade deck remained open along its whole length. Now, even with modern cruise ships, they all have their own little classes, and when you're on board, they're incredibly similar, but you can still immediately spot the differences. Every single passenger I ever spoke to was able to do that. Nobody was confused about what ship they were on. If you're going to try to tell people that the people who came on board to inspect and certify these ships were confused about whether they were on the Olympic or the Titanic, you're full of shit and you're lying. And to prove that they are lying, to give this conspiracy theory any kind of legs at all, take a look at this photo on the screen. Ancient conspiracy theorists suggest that these portholes are proof that the Titanic and the Olympic were switched, as evidenced by the way they labeled these photos. Now this is really interesting, because it does actually prove that the two ships were switched. By whoever labeled this fucking image. Oh my god. The top one is actually the Titanic, and the bottom one is actually the Olympic. But whoever did this switched them around. And you know, the sad thing is that this picture does actually fool people. If only there was a way to see the actual shipwreck for ourselves. If only there were photos and video and scans, then we could debunk this mystery once and for all. Oh wait, there is! James Cameron's made some of the greatest movies of all time, but he has just earned his greatest award yet, the Mystorian's official pap of approval. As you can clearly see, the wreckage here matches the Titanic. But if that's not good enough, In most cases when a ship is constructed, they are given unique construction identification numbers. Let me actually clarify that. 1 unique construction identification number. In the case of the Olympic and the Titanic, most of their structural, engine, and interior components were marked with their unique Harland and Wolff yard number, or unique ID number. The Titanic was marked with 401. The Olympic was marked with 400. And shock of horrors, all of the parts recovered from the Titanic wreckage are marked with 401, meaning it's the Titanic down there. Meanwhile though, when the Olympic was sold for scrap, all her parts were marked 400. Now can you imagine the insurmountable amount of effort required to have switched all of these parts prior to the Titanic setting sail? And if these people want to say, well, everybody there could just be lying about the ID numbers, well then can you imagine the sheer amount of people that you would need to silence or pay off for no one to come out and expose this, not in words and testimony, but with actual fucking parts of the wreckage? Have you ever seen a dry dock operation? There are far too many people for it to be possible for this cover-up to have taken place. It's almost like it would have actually been easier to just have the Titanic sail off and have an accident to commit insurance fraud. And again, if that was the plan, they would have still lost $2.5 million. So again, what the fuck was the point? The point is, the Titanic hit an iceberg and 1,500 people lost their lives. Stop spreading this ridiculous bullshit. Well anyway, speaking of icebergs, next up is the bloop. As per usual, something happens that experts don't immediately understand, and people are like, so what you're really saying is it's aliens, or sea monsters, or the great old one Cthulhu. And please, let it be Cthulhu so that I don't have to read any more of these stupid fucking stories. Well anyway, according to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who are the people that recorded the bloop, quote, in 1997, back when dinosaurs walked the Earth, researchers listening for underwater volcanic activity in the Southern Pacific recorded a strange, powerful, and extremely loud sound. Using hydrophones or underwater microphones that were placed more than 3,219 kilometers apart across the Pacific, they recorded numerous instances of the noise, which was unlike anything they had heard before. Not only was it loud, the sound had a unique characteristic that came to be known as the bloop, end quote. Now this is the bloop played back at 16 times speed to make it audible to human ears. Now this sound was detected by the Equatorial Pacific Ocean Autonomous Hydrophone Array, which sounds like something a James Bond villain would use, but this system of hydrophones was primarily used to monitor undersea seismicity, ice noise, and marine mammal population and migration. Remember that, specifically the ice noise part, because that will be important soon. Now soon after recording the bloop, NOAA was able to triangulate where the sound came from, and it came from a remote point west of the southern tip of South America. And this one particular bloop rose in frequency over about 1 minute and was actually loud enough to be heard on multiple sensors that were once again placed more than 3,219 kilometers apart. Quote, scientists from NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory were eager to discover the sound's origin, but with about 95% of the ocean unexplored, theories abounded. Was the bloop from a secret underwater military exercise, ship engines, fishing boat winches, giant squids, whales, or some other sea creature unknown to science? Hold up, that's not what it says. Or some sea creature unknown to science. Kinda pisses me off that they wrote that on their own website and left in this grammatical error. But whatever. Make life harder for assholes like me trying to debunk all the monsters. Now 4 years after recording the bloop, a guy from NOAA named Christopher Fox said in an interview that he initially believed the bloop to be ice carving in Antarctica. Ice carving, also known as glacier carving or iceberg carving, is the breaking of ice chunks from the edge of a glacier. When this happens, they make a loud cracking or booming sound, and then blocks of ice up to 60 meters or 200 feet high break loose and crash into the water. This then often causes massive and often hazardous waves, and in places like the Johns Hopkins Glacier can be so large that boats cannot approach closer than 3 kilometers. The next question is this common? The answer is yes. Ice carving is actually a major tourist attraction in places like Alaska. Now imagine Antarctica, where the largest icebergs in the world are. Now imagine a person that believes the Titanic and the Olympic were switched hearing about the Bloop. They're not gonna like this ice carving theory, and suddenly it's Cthulhu down there and he let one rip or something. Since you know we've only explored about 5% of the ocean, you don't know what's down there. Well yeah, nor do you. But I guess to the ancient conspiracy theorists' credit this time, it does seem like the ice carving theory was wrong. However, it was close. It was as close as damn it is to swearing, because the actual cause of the bloop seems to be from something called a cryoseism, an icequake. And they say that truth is stranger than fiction. Sure, why not? Quote, as the years passed, Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory researchers continued to deploy hydrophones ever closer to Antarctica in an ongoing effort to study the sounds of seafloor volcanoes and earthquakes. It was there, on Earth's lonely southernmost landmass, that they finally discovered the source of those thunderous rumbles from the deep in 2005. To be fair, I thought they said they recorded it in 1997, but it's right here on their website, 2005. Anyway, the bloop was the sound of an icequake, an iceberg cracking and breaking away from an Antarctic glacier. With global warming, more and more icequakes occur annually, breaking off glaciers, cracking, and eventually melting into the ocean. End quote. Now before I get colorful comments, how these experts figured this out is by studying icequakes for a living with the Equatorial Pacific Ocean Autonomous Hydrophone Array, a system of hydrophones primarily used to monitor undersea seismicity, ice noise, and marine mammal population and migration. Unlike what conspiracy theorists do for a living, eat crayons, which explains their colorful imaginations. Now, the everyday person doesn't have a hydrophone array, and since NOAA is the organization that recorded the bloop, I think the most sensible thing to do is trust them. Now, their studies show that the bloop spectrogram, the signal frequency's visual representation, is strikingly similar to the spectrograms of icequakes. And of the numerous icequakes that have been detected, many of them actually have the amplitude necessary to be detected from ranges exceeding 5,000 kilometers. And this is because sounds generated by icequakes are quite easily picked up by hydrophones, because seawater is quite a good sound channel, and it allows the ambient sounds generated through ice activities to travel great distances. Mystery solved. Now speaking of traveling great distances, our next story is the Philadelphia experiment.
And I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever heard.
According to military.com, quote, as military urban legends go, the Philadelphia experiment is one of the creepiest and most grotesque ever. It alleges that there was a secret US Navy experiment on the USS Eldridge during World War II, and claims that the ship was made invisible or cloaked to radar and even teleported or time traveled. What the fuck? According to legend, on October 28, 1943, the USS Eldridge, a Cannon-class destroyer escort, was conducting top-secret experiments designed to win command of the oceans against the Axis powers. The rumor was that the government was creating technology that would render naval ships invisible to enemy radar. And then the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, it was time to test it out. Witnesses claim an eerie green-blue glow surrounded the hull of the ship as her generator spun up, and then, suddenly, the Eldridge disappeared. The ship was then seen in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, before disappearing again and reappearing back in Philadelphia. The legend states that the classified military documents reported that the Eldridge crew were affected by the events in disturbing ways. Some went insane, others developed mysterious illnesses, but some were said to have been fused together with the ship, still alive, but with limbs sealed to the metal. End quote. Part of the crew, part of the ship. Part of the crew, part of the ship. Now what the fuck can you even say about a story like this? But since teleportation is something that gets brought up a lot in stories like this one in the Montauk Project, for example, let's talk about teleportation then. The real issue here is that if people had even just a rudimentary understanding of teleportation, this is something that would have undoubtedly been studied improved on, and in use in every single way that you can imagine it would be used today. A perfect example of that would be the internet. The internet was originally designed to be a communication system for the military. We all have it now, so where's the teleportation? Can you imagine how much money companies like Amazon would save if they didn't have to hire drivers or buy those drones to deliver shit? They could just zap the product right to you. And as far as the military goes, I'd imagine that they'd have a lot of uses for teleportation. But the problem is that there is no known physical mechanism in the universe that would allow for physical teleportation. Now, I know that scientists have just recently proven that quantum teleportation is real by quantumly teleporting the state of 3 photons or whatever, but that's a completely different thing. Quantum teleportation doesn't transfer matter, it transfers quantum information. So basically, quantum teleportation scans a particle state, destroys the original, and then recreates that exact state on a different pre-existing particle at a distance. The downside to that is that it's also not faster than light, so you can't even do that across the galaxies instantaneously. What a disappointment.
Absolute fucking useless.
So then what could be done with quantum teleportation one day? Well, a secure long-distance transfer of quantum information, powering an unhackable quantum internet, and linking quantum computers for greater power. Shit like that.
Absolute fucking useless.
The Philadelphia experiment, though, is talking about sci-fi teleportation, which is, at the moment at least, impossible. So therefore, it would have been impossible in 1943 as well. Japanese scientists spent 25 years trying to figure out how to quantum teleport 3 photons. And that's the boring shit. Imagine teleporting a fucking Navy destroyer with a bunch of people inside it. Another big issue with sci-fi teleportation is that it's still not faster than light travel, because you cannot exceed the cosmic speed limit, which kinda makes teleportation impossible when you think about it, unless you teleport slowly, which sounds kinda shitty. But whatever, this is not a Because Science episode with Kyle Hill.
Alright, surprise lightsaber!
Oh, brother, this guy.
We make fun of stupid shit. Now, this really stupid Philadelphia experiment story comes from a guy named Carl M. Allen, who went by the very clever pseudonym Carlos Miguel Allende. Well done, sir.
My name is Jeff.
Did you wear a fake mustache as well? Anyway, 1955, Carl sent an anonymous package marked Happy Easter containing a copy of Maury K. Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, to the US Office of Naval Research. When they received it and opened it up, they noticed that this book was filled with handwritten notes in its margins. And these handwritten notes were written in 3 different shades of blue ink, in an effort, I suppose, to make it appear as a debate amongst 3 different people. And only one of these people are named and goes by the name Jemmy. Now, the 3 people writing in this book comment on Jessup's ideas about the propulsion for flying saucers, discussed alien races, and expressed concern that Jessup was too close to discovering their technology. Anyway, the US Office of Naval Research threw that book in the trash. A little while later, after not getting the attention he was looking for, in 1956, Carl sent a series of letters to Maury K. Jessup himself, the author of the book The Case for the UFO. Now, according to military.com again, quote, "In these letters, Carl argued that UFOs merit further study. In his UFO book, Jessup apparently included something about the unified field theory, because this is what Carl Allen latched onto for further correspondences. I guess he was just using that to explain the whole story of teleportation and people fusing to the ship." Quote, "In the 1950s, the unified field theory, which has never been proven, attempted to merge Einstein's general theory of relativity with electromagnetism. In fact, Carl Allen claimed to have been taught by Einstein himself and could prove the unified field theory based on events he witnessed on October 28, 1943. Carl Allen claimed that he saw the USS Eldridge disappear from the Philadelphia Naval Yard, and he further insisted that the United States military had conducted what he called the Philadelphia experiment and was trying to cover it up." End quote. Now, Carl Allen claimed to have witnessed this whole thing while serving aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth. Luckily, he was not on the Eldridge Horror and fused to the ship. Amazingly though, Maury Jessup challenged Carl on this whole thing and asked for more information, but Carl said that his memory would have to be recovered. So he referred Jessup to what seems to be a non-existent Philadelphia newspaper article that Allen claimed covered the incident. What a troll. Then in 1957, Maury Jessup was actually invited to the Office of Naval Research, where he was shown the annotated copy of his book that they took out of the trash for some reason that Carl sent in anonymously. And Jessup recognized the handwriting in the margins. This was Carl Allen's handwriting. 12 years later, Allen would say that he authored all of the annotations in order to, quote, scare the hell out of Jessup. Whoa, what a troll. There's some more to the story, like two officers at the Office of Naval Research saying something like, oh damn, invisibility sounds really good. Imagine how many people we could kill with that. But then they found nothing of substance to the whole Eldritch horror story. And so the book went back into the trash. Sadly, that's where Jessup's career ended up. He tried to sell more UFO books, but was unsuccessful. He then lost his publisher and received a lot of heavy blows in his personal life. And ultimately, he took his own life on April 30th, 1959. And that really sucks. Now, after the story went what could be considered viral in the 1950s, writers tried to contact Carl for more information, but this dude just changed his niche from sci-fi to paranormal and ghosted everybody. What a clever joke that was. No one could find this fucking guy anywhere, so his family was interviewed instead. And they described Carl Allen as a fantastic mind, but also a drifter and a master leg puller. Moses. Well, okay then. So what actually happened on board the USS Eldritch Horror to spawn such a stupid story? Well, according to military.com, quote, according to Edward Dudgeon, who served in the US Navy on board the USS Engstrom, which was dry docked in the Philadelphia Naval Yard while the Eldritch was, both ships did have classified devices on board. However, they were neither invisibility cloaks nor teleportation drives designed by aliens, but instead, they scrambled the magnetic signatures of ships using the degaussing technique, which provided protection from magnetic torpedoes aboard U-boats. How stuff works suggested that the green glow reported by the witnesses that day could be explained by an electric storm or St. Elmo's fire, which, in addition to being an American coming-of-age film starring the Brat Pack, is a weather phenomenon in which plasma is created in a strong electric field, giving off a bright glow, almost like fire. End quote. And they say the truth is stranger than fiction. Anyway, the USS Eldritch was transferred to Greece in 1951 and then sold for scrap during the 1990s. I wonder what they did with all the skeletons, or why they didn't mention them. Speaking of skeletons, I guess it's time to address the iceberg in the room. This video is not really much of an iceberg video since I'm really taking my time on these stories. But more often than not, iceberg videos are quite shit, aren't they? It's like the people couldn't be asked to just explain the story a bit further or, find the solution. Anyway, on to the next story. The St. Augustine Monster, also known as the Florida Monster. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression before, the truth is stranger than fiction, because this story is a great example of that being incorrect.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever heard.
In fact, most stories that I've been covering lately are great examples of that. Anyway, on the evening of November 30th, 1896, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, two young boys by the names of Herbert Cole and Dunham Corritor were riding their bikes along Anastasia Island just east of St. Augustine, Florida, when they spotted a giant glob half buried in the sand, having sunk under its own immense body weight. Now you'd think that two young boys would have a very wild imagination that would spot something strange like this and they would say, holy shit, it's a fucking dinosaur. Nope, they said, this looks like the remains of a beached whale. And they probably thought this since something similar was found about 2 years earlier near the mouth of the Matanzas River, just a couple of miles to the south of St. Augustine. But they returned to St. Augustine anyway and reported their find. Because somebody got to do something about that nasty glob on the beach. The following day, a local physician by the name of Dr. DeWitt Webb, who was the founder of the St. Augustine Historical Society and Institute of Science, by the way, came to the beach to examine the remains. He believed it was the remains of a dinosaur.
Yes, science!
No, he actually said giant octopus, which is basically the same thing. Some other people came to check this thing out and they said the same thing. It has long tentacles and whatever, it must be a giant octopus. Now, I have been told before that I pronounced the word octopus wrong, but don't try to octopus me off in the comments by telling me that. Now, quote-unquote giant octopus do exist, but the term giant might be a bit misleading. because the biggest ones that have ever been discovered have tentacles that are about 16 feet long, and they can weigh up to about 600 pounds. However, the St. Augustine monster was described as weighing probably 4 or 5 tons, and one of its longest tentacles was about 30 feet long and 8 inches thick. So that's already at least twice the size of anything ever discovered. But to be fair, at the moment it's not an outlandish claim. It will become an outlandish claim in a bit. While examining this thing, they assumed that it wasn't a complete creature. To the people examining it, it looked as if parts of it had been eaten off or broken off, or just decayed away. So they thought that the tentacles may have actually been longer than 30 feet. Anyway though, sometime between January 9th and 15th, a storm tide came in and dragged the St. Augustine monster back out to sea. But then, it came back! This thing washed ashore again with the next tide on Crescent Beach in St. Johns County, Florida, about 2 miles to the south of its original location. Dr. DeWitt Webb then sent some photographs of the giant octopus, along with a description to Joel Asaph Allen of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. Allen apparently didn't reply, but Webb's letters did come to the attention of Professor Addison Emery Verrill of Yale, at that time the foremost authority on cephalopods in the country. At first, Verrill suggested that the carcass might represent the remains of a giant squid. In the January 1897 issue of the American Journal of Science, he wrote, quote, "The proportions given by Webb indicate that this might have been a squid-like form." Yeah, I'm not going to do the whole thing in that voice. It's squid-like form and not an octopus. The breadth is evidently that of a softened and collapsed body, and would represent an actual maximum diameter in life of at least 7 feet, and a probable weight of about 4 or 5 tons for the body and head. Moses, so even heavier. He went on to say that these dimensions are decidedly larger than those of any of the well-authenticated Newfoundland specimens. It is perhaps a species of the Architeuthis. You know, I doubt that I'll ever use this word again in my life, so I'm not going to check how it's actually pronounced. But Architeuthis is my best guess. Now, impressively, at the time of this whole St. Augustine monster story, there was zero evidence at all of giant squid existing. Evidence was only found in 1925 when arm fragments of a giant squid were found inside of a sperm whale. However, we know today that giant squid are some of the largest creatures in the world and can grow to a length of about 43 feet, while the heavier but shorter colossal squids grow to about 30 feet. Just look at this chonky boy over here. It's quite weird to think that it took until 2025 to film a colossal squid for the first time. Well, 95% of the ocean is unexplored, so I mean the St. Augustine monster could have just been one of Cthulhu's bloops. True, it could be a Cthulhu turd. Could also just be a whale. Anyway, a little while later, Verrill changed his mind and said that this thing could actually be a giant octopus after all, and said, quote, "Its head was nearly destroyed, and only the stumps of 2 arms were visible. The body, as it lies somewhat embedded in the sand, is 18 feet long and about 7 feet wide, while it rises about 3.5 feet above the sand. The weight of the body and head would have been at least 4 or 5 tons. If the arms held the proportions usually seen in smaller species of the octopus, they would have been at least 75 to 100 feet in length and about 18 inches in diameter at the base." End quote. I suppose at this point, foremost expert in the world Addison Verrill said,
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
He then requested some samples to do a proper examination. Dr. DeWitt Webb then said okay, sent them over, and when Verrill examined them, he said, "Hold the fuck on! This creature cannot be an octopus because it is of cetacean nature." Basically, it came from a whale. Just like the 2 boys on the beach said. Verrill then suggested that the whole mass represents the upper part of a head of a sperm whale, detached from the skull and the jaw. Mystery solved! Amazing! People then forgot about this thing until about 1957, when a guy named Forrest Glenn Wood, the curator of the Marine Land of Florida and a founding member of the International Society of Cryptozoology, became interested in the story after finding a yellowed newspaper clipping mentioning the creature. Now, as we know, cryptozoology is of course the hobby of wasting time, eating crayons, and making up bullshit stories about creatures that don't exist. So naturally, Forrest Wood got his hands on a sample of the monster and started comparing the connective tissue of the sample to specimens from squid and octopus. To the surprise of no one, He said that the monster was in fact a 75-foot-long giant octopus because he'd be out of a job otherwise. Forrestwood then published his findings in the March 1971 issue of Natural History, probably written in crayon, saying, quote, "After 75 years, the moment of truth was at hand. Viewing section after section of the St. Augustine samples, we decided at once, and beyond any doubt, that the sample was not whale blubber. Further, the connective tissue pattern was that of broad bands in the plane of the section with equally broad bands arranged perpendicularly, a structure similar to, if not identical with, that in my octopus sample." Sure, buddy, sure. The evidence appears unmistakable that the St. Augustine sea monster was in fact an octopus, but the implications are fantastic. Even though the sea presents us from time to time with strange and astonishing phenomena, the idea of a gigantic octopus with arms 75 to 100 feet in length and about 18 inches in diameter at the base, a total spread of some 200 feet, is difficult to comprehend. Well, indeed they are. Anyway, as proof that you can't trust cryptozoologists, a guy named Roy Mackal, a biochemist at the University of Chicago and a founding member of the International Society of Cryptozoology, just like Forrestwood, decided to test the samples for himself. He too published his findings in an issue of Cryptozoology, a whole magazine probably written in crayon. Quote, "I conclude that it was essentially a huge mass of collagenous protein. Certainly the tissue was not blubber. I interpret these results as consistent with and supportive of Webb and Verrill's identification of the carcass as that of a gigantic cephalopod, probably an octopus, not referable to any known species." End quote. Because he certainly did not have a bias. Anyway, these samples were then examined again in 1995 by biologists at the University of Maryland under an electron microscope and subjected to biochemical analysis. And what was found this time was the shit was just in fact fucking whale blubber. Like the two boys on the beach said. And they say that the truth is stranger than fiction. Dr. Sidney Pierce, who analyzed it this time, said the samples consisted of almost pure collagen with no cellular structure. Collagen is a structural protein. In fact, it's the body's most abundant structural protein. And going by their own measurements of the thing they found on the beach, they said one of the longest tentacles was about 30 feet. Well, what a surprise, sperm whales are bigger than that. They can reach up to 60 feet long. Anyway, let's hear from the expert. Dr. Sidney Pierce said, quote, "The St. Augustine remains were probably those of a whale that had floated in the sea for weeks. Its bones had fallen to the ocean floor while animals and bacteria had consumed everything but the hard, indigestible collagen matrix of the blubber." Dr. Sidney Pierce then went on to conclude, very much like Professor Addison Verrill, that the St. Augustine discovery was the remains of a whale. Likely the entire skin, the blubber layer, nothing more, nothing less. End quote. By the way, this thing was examined again in 2004, and the results confirmed Dr. Pierce's findings. This glob was just whale blubber. Kinda funny how two boys on the beach just looked at this glob quickly, said, "Yep, looks like a fucking whale to me," and they were actually right. This story kinda reminds me of the Montauk Monster. People looked at this thing and said, "Oh my god, the government has cracked time travel and mind control at Camp Hero in Montauk. This creature is proof of that." But then, it just turned out to be a raccoon. Because the truth is so much stranger than fiction. Anyway, I got one more story and then I'm gonna fuck off for another week. The Baltic Sea Anomaly. I have no doubt that if you watch unsolved mystery channels on YouTube, you've heard about this one before. But before I start this one, I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine that you're an alien from an extremely advanced civilization. For shits and giggles, let's say that you're from the nearest star system to ours, Alpha Centauri. So you're about 4.37 light years away, or 41 trillion kilometers away. So just down the road. Now let's say since you're so clever that you've cracked light speed travel, or even warp speed or wormholes and infinite fuel and energy, since we're going so heavy on the crayons for this mental exercise, and then you got into your very advanced alien UFO. You then travel from Alpha Centauri all the way through this massive expanse of space, navigating flawlessly with all your complicated spaceship algorithms, and then you finally arrive at Earth so you can see what all the Earthlings are up to. You turn your invisibility on, of course, because you're so clever, And also because you're a bit antisocial. You don't want to be seen. You don't want to be filmed and then put on the History Channel, because you cannot imagine anything worse than ending up on the History Channel. And as you pass through the atmosphere, you come out over the Baltic Sea. Now, since you're so clever and everything, you crash. Just straight into the fucking water. That's what you gotta believe to believe that this photo here is showing an alien UFO. Right, now with that all out of the way, let's see if we can figure out what this thing actually is. According to IFL Science, which for some reason I remember as I fucking love science, quote, "The Baltic Sea Anomaly was first uncovered by Peter Lindbergh, Dennis Asperg, and their Swedish Ocean X diving team, a world-leading deep-sea exploration company dedicated to uncovering lost treasures, historical shipwrecks, and underwater anomalies," as stated on their website. In 2011, they set out on an expedition and captured a strange sonar image that depicted some kind of structure on the sea floor at a depth of around 91 meters. Now, these guys claim that their image shows a 60-meter circular object with unusual features of seemingly non-natural origin. And when this story broke, people lost their lunch. Newspapers were printing that this thing was your sunken UFO that you crashed into the Baltic Sea because you're so clever. Well done. Quote, "When Ocean X went back to see what in the blue hell this thing could be, they encountered peculiar interferences, which they claimed meant everything electric. Everything, including their satellite phone, stopped working when they were above the object. Amazingly, their little submarine thing didn't. That would have been bad. But once they put around 200 meters between themselves and the mystery structure, everything started working again." Bullshit. Stop lying to people. If that was true, how did you capture this image? Samples of stone recovered at the site by Ocean X were given to a guy named Volker Bruchert, an associate professor of geology at the Stockholm University. Bruchert's analysis of the samples indicated that most of them were granites, gneiss, and sandstones. Normal stones you find in the ocean. Now, among these samples was one loose piece of basaltic, which is basically volcanic rock, which is the only thing that seemed kinda out of place there, but also not really unusual. According to people who know what they're talking about, because the whole northern Baltic region is so heavily influenced by glacial thawing processes, both the feature and the rock samples are likely to have formed in connection with glacial and post-glacial processes. Possibly these rocks were transported there by glaciers. So that's pretty definitive in my mind. However, I like to lay the smackdown on these stories so thick that I kill them once and for all. So I've got some more evidence for you. According to a guy named Hanuman Singh of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, these sonar scans cannot be trusted because of several distortions that render it, quote, "virtually useless for identifying an undersea formation." According to Singh, the distortions are due to a cheap, inaccurate sonar instrument that was improperly wired and calibrated. Well, damn. Even an MSNBC report said that people are interpreting this image as a UFO because of the graphic outlines intended to suggest a fictional spaceship, the Millennium Falcon, which were drawn onto the sonar image by tabloid newspapers. Furthermore, scientists, geologists, marine archaeologists, geomorphologists, and geophysicists have examined this thing and have all said the same thing. It's a natural rock formation. According to How Stuff Works, quote, "The Ocean X team found mostly run-of-the-mill stones that you would expect from the kind of glacial basin the Baltic Sea fills. Not exactly that wacky, considering that glaciers could have easily carried the rock from somewhere else. And for that matter, glaciers could have carried big chunks of rocks like the entire formation itself. Most experts agree that the structure is probably nothing close to man-made. It might be a glacial deposit. It could also be a rock outcropping, which would totally make sense on the ocean floor," end quote. So that's kinda disappointing. Another UFO mystery debunked. But you know, I've really been wondering, why are there so many of these UFO mysteries? That's what I find truly interesting. And it doesn't seem like I'm the only one. A guy named Jonathan Hill of the Mars Space Flight Facility also questioned the motives of Ocean X. And he had good reason to do so because Ocean X planned to take wealthy tourists in a submarine tour to visit the site. So they could see some rocks for themselves. Jonathan Hill said, quote, "Whenever people make extraordinary claims, it's always a good idea to consider for a moment whether they are personally benefiting from the claim or if it's a truly objective observation." End quote. He also suggested that it would have been simple to break off a piece and have it geologically tested, but test results showing that it was simply rock would not have benefited Ocean X's Peter Lindbergh. So it turns out that the sample rocks were actually from around the formation. Because there is a plot afoot. During a 2019 interview, Peter Lindbergh said that there may be a possibility for a new expedition via a TV production in which they are involved. So there you go. Fame and money. That's why there's so many UFO stories. But that's about all I can handle for today. If you are in the mood for another infuriating maritime mystery, may I recommend my video on the Orang Medan. But if you're in the mood for something a little more real, I've got the most likely theory for the Mary Celeste, the most likely theory for the Flannan Lighthouse Keepers, and the weird story of the SS Morro Castle. That's a pretty old video, so it's kinda shit, but the story's still interesting. Anyways, leave your thoughts and theories in the comment section, like the video, subscribe for more bullshit from the Mystorian, and I'll see you guys again next week with some more silly mysteries that piss me off. Thanks for watching.